If you're looking to play Amulet Titan at the upcoming RC Denver like I am, or maybe another competitive event, or even at your local shop, then this video is intended to help you learn about the deck building decisions you should be thinking about and what cards I'm selecting in preparation for this event. I've been playing Amulet Titan in Modern for the better part of about 6 years right now. I have a lot of reps with this deck, especially on paper, and hoping I can share my expertise with you to help you make these decisions preparing for this event coming up. If you want a full primer for this deck, there will be another video that I'll maybe link below or at the end of this video to give you a detailed how-to guide on how to play this. But for today, we're just going to be focusing specifically on preparing this deck in the current meta and what cards I'm choosing, what style of deck we're choosing. And even if I can't tell you the exact cards that you should play in your list, I'm going to give you the exact questions you should be asking yourselves when thinking about what should be the 15th card in my sideboard, which land should I be playing in the flex slot in the main deck, what composition of spells and such should I be sideboarding in and thinking about when I'm playing in certain matchups. So I've been experimenting with a lot of different builds. This 60 card main board is approximately what I'm close to playing. So starting by looking at the lands, we have our 10 bounce lands over here. 10 is the number of bounce lands I would recommend for your list. It's what most people are playing right now. The 4 Simic Growth Chamber is pretty standard, which gives you the blue mana that is requisite to play Talaria West and could also be important based on what sideboard cards you're playing. Then the other 5 green bounce lands are going to take the role of what color your sideboard package is playing. So you obviously usually want a Gruul Turf and a Selesnya Sanctuary, which helps pay for your haste land, Slayer Stronghold. But I'm playing more slanted towards the red because I'm interested and curious at some red sideboard cards. We'll get into that as we talk a little more about the list. Boros Garrison is here. You could also play a 10th green bounce land instead if you're playing Heinweir Garrison instead of Slayer Stronghold. I personally like Slayer Stronghold. I think the +2/+0 is very relevant in adding extra damage to your Titan, and the Vigilance is super important, right? Slayer Stronghold does give Vigilance where Heinweir Garrison does not. Now, Heinweir is a little bit easier to activate with the single red mana, but I just find that I like the additional layered in effects of Slayer's Stronghold. And I think if you're playing Heinweir Garrison, you then are committed to Littjara, which I do like, but you're also committed to Kessig Wolfrun because you need that extra damage to push through. And Heinweir plus Littjara plus Kessig plus another green bounce land does take more slots in your deck. So if you're willing to commit an additional slot in that haste package, then you can go for the Heinweir Littjara Kessig package. But you can also play Slayers and Sunhome Fortress of the Legion. Sunhome is the other option that I'm highly considering right now because with Slayers and Sunhome, you can obviously kill with a single Titan and 2 amulets. Or you can supercharge a double Titan hand a little more easily rather than the package I have right now. So with 2 Titans, 2 Slayers activations, and 2 Sunhome activations, you can deal 32 damage. Currently, even if I get 2 Titans in play, a single one, and then maybe even a second one with the Mirror Lake, you can only do 21 damage, right? The Littjara gives a +1 counter. Slayers can enable both the Titans with haste, that's 16 damage. And then you can actually Vesuva your Slayers and give the 2 Titans the +2/+0 again for a total of 21 damage. So I'm making a concession by not playing something like Kessig Wolfrun or the double strike land, but I'm also giving myself more lands to play around with. And I actually like Littjara over the double strike land. I don't think it comes up as much when you're going for that combo kill because they do the same amount of damage, but it does come up a lot when you are making these value plays or stabilizing the board, right? So I made a post about it here actually in the Amulet Discord, which if you're not in it, I'll post it in the description of this video as well. I wrote, often you can deal a similar amount of damage when going for a win with double Amulet with Littjara's Slayers package or with the Slayers Sunhome package. However, it's better in going for value lines where you can't win. So getting 2 Titans in play with less mana is a lot easier, right? So if you do want to double Titan to sort of stabilize the board, it's a lot easier to do with Littjara because it's less mana. If you have a single Titan, even if you have 2 amulets and you want to get a second Titan in play, you need to get T-West and Simic Growth Chamber, which makes 6 mana, and you still need to have 3 additional mana to transmute and play a follow-up Titan. So it's a little more mana intensive for a line like that. It's also going to do things like put more lands into play for Dryad of the Elysian Grove. If you have a Dryad in play, and you might not have, maybe sometimes you don't have any lands in play and you need to get more lands in play to trigger Valakut to go for the kill because they have some blockers and such in play. It's a little bit easier to do that with this Littjara type of package just because you can get more lands onto the battlefield when you have so many more Titan triggers. You can do things like when you're playing against Rhinos, it's a lot more risky to swing in with one Titan rather than more easily being able to get a second Titan down in case they have like an instant speed Rhinos and can double block one of your Titans. You then have two bodies, so one of the Titans will survive. You can do things like make a copy of your own Cultivator classes with Littjara Mirror Lake to enable another Cultivator spin if you really need to. You can play around Force of Negation because if you want to make a second Titan without the Littjara, again, you need to tutor for a Summoner's Pact and play the Summoner's Pact, and sometimes that will get countered by non-creature counter magic. So there's these kind of little things that have added up to me. There's no one particular reason I like it better, but these little things have made it a little bit more of a favorable option for me. That's not to say there are not advantages to Sunhome. As I mentioned, Sunhome enables more damage and such, but I have personally found that I've liked Littjara just a little bit better, and I'm going to be rolling with it for right now. I also am playing one copy of Vesuva. Some people are playing two copies of Vesuva and omitting a single copy of Valakut. Doing this has very subtle advantages. It enables more live draws for you in the face of stuff like Blood Moon, where maybe you have a forest and you want to, top decking of Vesuva can let you copy it and make another forest. Or maybe you just want that second bounce land, and drawing Vesuva is better than Valakut because you can commit your first bounce land into the battlefield and then play your second bounce land. You can make a copy of Littjara Mirror Lake, and then you can have more opportunities to make more copies of your Titan with more copies of Littjara. You have a higher chance of going turn one Urza Saga, and then Vesuva copying your Urza Saga, making a second Urza Saga. So there are some benefits. However, there are also some drawbacks, right? When you have only one Valakut in your deck and you're swinging in for a potential lethal line with Titan and you have no Valakuts in play, if you have 4 lands, you're swinging with Titan, you cannot fetch up 2 Valakuts, because if you fetch up Valakut Vesuva, Vesuva can't enter and copy the Valakut you're also getting with the Titan trigger. So there are certain play patterns that are no longer available to you if you only have one Valakut in your deck, which I'm not as much of a fan of. But some people might be okay with that compromise with the extra equity you're getting with double Vesuvas. Also with double Vesuva, if you draw one, you have an extra one in your deck that you can obviously get, that you can fetch with a Titan trigger, which could make certain draws a little bit less awkward. So there is still some value there, and it's something you should maybe consider for your list. I'm also playing the 2 Tolaria West. This is pretty standard. It's another way to fetch your Titan. I'm not going to go too into detail about that. And one Gemstone Cavern, maybe the most questionable land that I'm playing, that a couple people have seen playing in their sideboards. I know Dom Harvey is very high on this card, and I am as well after playing with it for a lot. Gemstone Cavern's super good. It comes up more often than you would think. You're usually playing on average about 50% of your games in the draw. And personally, I'm seeing this card somewhere between 10 and 20% of my openers on the draw, partially because I would also consider mulliganing counting as part of that. So on a mull to 6, I'm still happy to sometimes see a Gemstone Caverns. And I think the value of Gemstone Caverns does go up too when you're playing cards like the Ring that can refuel your hand more easily. I also think that's the same reason why I like Force of Vigor and other cards that are willing to just pitch cards in my deck. I think getting that head start when you're on the draw is so valuable, and it's kind of hard, almost hard to explain why it's so good, but it enables so many more lines with the deck. A turn 1 Gemstone Cavern, a turn 0 Gemstone Cavern into like a turn 1 Forest plus Amulet very easily enables a turn 2 One Ring, which is extremely powerful. You could even do stuff like Gemstone Cavern, play your land for the turn, play an Amulet, Grazer in another land, and just do some crazy lines. And again, these are obviously much more powerful when you have the One Ring to refuel your hand. But I'm telling you, the card is very strong. I almost even want to play a second one in my 75, maybe in the sideboard, but maybe that's wishful thinking. And I'm definitely committing to one in the 75 somewhere I'm pretty confident on for Denver. I'm playing 4 forests in my list. Some people play 3. I'm probably closer to playing 3 than I am to playing 5, but I personally like 4. I think Magus and Blood Moon are very big problematic cards that are roaming around right now, and I like having enough untapped green sources in the deck for my turn 1 play. And you might say, Nick, well, you could actually play the 3rd Boseiju in your main deck over the 4th Forest, and that's true. I do think Boseiju is slightly better post sideboard, and I actually want enough lands in my sideboard to bring in when I take out like a bunch of Urza Sagas and stuff against like Rhinos and Murktide. So I actually like bringing Boseiju, and I don't really want to play a basic forest in my sideboard. I guess I could play like a Generous Ent, which is an option, but I do just want to make sure my land density is high enough, and this is just how I felt comfortable playing with the deck. I'm actually probably closer to playing 1 Crumbling Vestige than 2. I just have 2 in here because I don't really know what I want to be my last land yet. I'm still figuring this out. This is probably the most flexible land right now, and I would actually just recommend playing 1 Crumbling Vestige. I think Crumbling Vestige is the unsung hero of the Amulet deck. It's an MVP. Being able to fetch something that will generate mana the turn it enters with a Titan trigger is insanely valuable. Like when you don't have an Amulet in play, Crumbling Vestige is very, very strong. You can also have a Vesuvius or Crumbling Vestige, and it just helps you commit more mana to the battlefield with an Amulet while also not having to bounce a land like you do with a bounce land. It's just super good. You can go turn 1 Urza Saga into Amulet, turn 2 play a Vestige and make a construct token. You can do turn 1 land Amulet, turn 1 Urza Saga with no Amulet, turn 2 land, and then turn 3 play like get your Amulet and play like a Crumbling Vestige and play a Ring. You just have a lot of good play patterns that open up, and like you could do it with a bounce land, but you don't have to return the lands to your hand, and you want to keep developing your mana, which also makes the Valakuts more powerful. I think that I'm really like putting a lot of value on the Valakut Dryad package. I think that's a plan I like to lean into in a lot of games, and being able to commit lands to the battlefield while also producing extra mana is super important. Additionally, one of the things when you're top decking that's most important, oftentimes I find myself really wanting a bounce land or a land that makes 2 mana. Those are a lot of the time one of your best draws. A lot of times you already have a Titan or a Pact and you need to bridge to get to it, or you just need to make that extra mana to do something important for a turn. And having these Crumbling Vestige just adds another opportunity to top deck a land that produces 2 mana. Drawing them is in your opening hand is really good, and having them as fetchable targets is also very good. Cavern of Souls is a nod to the amount of Murktide players I've been playing against online recently. It's not super great. I'm not happy to play it. I almost kind of want to cut it from my 75 entirely, but I do still have it. I don't necessarily even recommend you play this card at the event, but if you think there will be a lot of Murktide players, and there will be some Murktide players, then you should consider it. It does beat the card counterspell very nicely. It only takes 1 slot in your deck, and I don't really have a card I really want to play over it right now. You could consider playing any of these cards over it, like Third Boseiju, a Radiant Fountain, which is good in against a lot of matchups that I sideboard in a lot anyways. Bojuka Bog is pretty good in a bunch of different matchups. Something for consideration. I play 2 Boseiju. You can play 3 Boseiju. I wouldn't play 4 Boseiju, and I wouldn't play 1 Boseiju. I think 2 or 3 is the correct number. I personally like 2 and use the third one as a land I bring in a lot of matchups post sideboard. And then I play 2 Mycosynth Gardens. Some people play 3 or 4 of this card. I'm not as high on this card as some other people because I think it gives the Amulet deck a bit push towards that all-in game plan, and I like to be a little bit more resilient. I'm not a big fan of playing into the hate as much that a lot of these of my opponent's decks are bringing in, stuff like Force of Vigor, Maguses, and hate for artifacts and enchantments. So I'm playing a mana base that's a little bit more resilient, I guess. I don't want to overcommit to too many amulets in play, and I actually have been happy with the 2 gardens. I might be losing a marginal amount of equity in the mirror, but I actually think my mirror matches are really good with the list that I've been putting together for this event. If you want to play more copies of Gardens, I wouldn't blame you, but I don't think it suits my personal playstyle as much with the deck, and I've been pretty happy with just having 2 for now. My package of 27 spells is pretty stock at the moment. I've tried lists with 2 Explorers. I've tried chopping Azusa, but every time I cut Azusa, I always miss it. I've tried cutting Expedition Map in some of these leagues I've been playing. By the way, I have played about 10 or so leagues in the past week with this deck, so I have been getting a lot of reps with the deck recently to prepare myself. So I'm just giving you guys kind of like the feel I've been having with the meta right now and what I think is correct or maybe not correct. Same with what I'm going to talk about with the sideboard as well. If you haven't had the chance to play online or on paper recently, I'm hoping I can fill in some of those gaps for you and give you some ideas for what you should be thinking about with certain decks you're playing against. I think Cultivator Colossus is still pretty important to have in the deck and can crawl you back from games that you were behind from and can give you these awesome combo kills. We're playing the Titans in the Summoners pack. We're playing the 4 Dryad, the 4 One Ring, and 1 copy of Azusa. We're playing a copy of Expedition Map, which is a nice target to grab with Urza Saga. I don't need to talk too much about this package. If you want to learn more about how the package kind of works, again, I do have a primer that's like on this deck if you want to learn more about how to play it, but I'm not doing anything fancy with these spells. I think this is just the right spell package to have in your deck. I don't really care much for Spelunking. Spelunking is a card that we can start with talking about Spelunking and exploring the sideboard. Spelunking and Explore are additional cards that you may want to consider for your main deck. I've also considered chopping maybe like a Crumbling Vestige or a Cavern to play and Explore in the main deck. If you do choose to play copies of these are nice things to have in your deck because they add additional redundancy to the deck. It's more copies of ramp for your deck, which is nice. You just need to ask yourself this question: what are you chopping to make room for that? And what are you missing out on with that card being in your deck to add this additional card? So like I see people chopping Azusa for 2 copies of Azusa and like a land for 2 copies of Explore, but what are you missing out on to add that package into your deck? Azusa is a really important tutor target in a lot of lines. A lot of times I will like play a turn 1 Amulet, and then turn 2 I will Summoner's Pact for Azusa, not even to play a Titan, but just to play all my lands out. And against especially a deck that doesn't have a lot of removal, you play your Azusa, you have enough to pay for Pact, and the following turn, you just play a bounce land 3 times and play Titan. Like that's a line, and there are many others, but that's a line you just no longer have access to because you don't have Azusa in your deck. And Azusa is also always a great draw too. So drawing Azusa in a lot of games and having it in your opener is very powerful. The land effect of Azusa is obviously stronger than Dryads, and I think having that target as like a 5 of through Summoner's Pact in your deck is worth the inclusion of it. If you're going to play Explore over something like Cavern, you just have to realize that, okay, you're playing less turn 1 green sources for Grazer. You're now losing a little bit of equity against Murktide. Not a lot, but a little bit. You have 1 less untapped land in your deck. You also just have 1 less land in your deck in general when you shave down to 32. It doesn't seem like a big difference, but going from like 30, every single land you cut does make a pretty big difference. And post sideboard, I never like to cut down to less than 30 lands unless you absolutely have to. And I would not recommend for your sideboard guides that you cut down to less than 30 lands in any matchup. That's also why I have some lands in my sideboard. I like to have 2 to 4 lands in the board to bring in to replace, because some matchups I will sideboard at like 5 lands. So I need to bring in a few to replace those. If you are interested in playing Explore or Spelunking in your main deck, I would recommend Explore personally in your main deck. I think it's just better to have the option for 1 less mana. You have more access to amulets anyways in game 1, and you don't need the additional effect from Spelunking. Spelunking is nicer as a sideboard option. So if you're going to play one of these in the sideboard, Spelunking's nice, especially because the matchups you want are the matchups where you don't have as many amulets in your deck. Maybe you're taking out some Urza Sagas or some Gardens because of whatever hate your opponent might have. So Spelunking will give you an additional copy of that amulet effect while also giving you some ramp, like maybe you take out an Azusa or a Grazer or something in a matchup as well. So it's nice to have some ramp to supplement what you're removing from the deck. Personally, I'm not really considering either of those in my deck right now. The cards I'm most interested in my sideboard are these cards right here, and these are all cards that are just on my radar that I'm looking at. I'm kind of experimenting between these different cards. We already talked about these 2. Let's talk about the ones that I'm pretty sure I'm going to be playing some number of my list, starting with Defense Grid. Defense Grid is a super impactful card against the blue decks. Rhinos, Murktide. You can bring it again against Living End, Death Shadow, Grixis Control. Any decks that are playing counterspells or something like Subtlety, it's really important to bring this card in against. Some people are playing less copies. I think 3 has been a good amount for me. You could even play 4 copies if you're really expecting a lot of stuff like Rhinos and Murktide, which I am. And I think this card is a great option in Amulet right now. It shuts off a lot of your opponent's interaction points and makes you feel a lot safer deploying your threats into play. Force of Vigor is a great card in the mirror matchup. I'm not going to talk about this too much, and a lot of Amulet players aren't super high on this card. I expect to play against a good amount of the mirror. Amulet's like a tier 1, tier 1.5 deck, and I think I will see a lot of the mirror match, and this card just hoses the mirror match when you have it in your hand. It also helps some matchups that are already kind of good, like, yeah, you can bring it in against Hammer and Hardened Scales. Technically, you're already favored, but with this card, it's like a slam dunk. You can kind of win or guarantee those matchups even harder. They're not like complete buys. You still have to work for the wins. They're favorable, but it does help other types of matchups like that. Maybe the Jeskai Breach deck a little bit more, but it really is for the mirror match. And I think this card is just so good in the mirror. I've kept hands that do nothing but play Force of Vigor and pitch this card, and you just win. You can just literally hit your land drops with Amulet against the Amulet player, and then a lot of times they keep these hands, and sometimes they'll mill pretty low to like 5 to keep like a Saga Amulet hand, and you just pitch your Force and strip mine them and blow up their 1 mana thing for 0 mana, and you just play your land drops and just play Titan and win. So I think it's very good. I also think stuff like Gemstone Caverns makes the Amulet mirror better because it even helps the games when you're on the draw by quite a bit. Now, these are the reasons why we're playing some of these red splash cards. And we haven't tested all the red splash cards yet. There's other ones I want to try. These are the ones I'm the highest on right now. Storm's Wrath, I've been testing, and I've also been testing Fire Spout a little bit. I personally think Fire Spout is better against anything that's not specifically Rhinos. So I like Fire Spout against Scam, which eats all their creatures, right? It eats a Grief that's been bounced back by a Not Dead After All. It eats Dorothy Voidwalker. It eats Ragavan. It eats all the threats, Bowmaster and the tokens out of Scam. It also hits all the relevant stuff out of Murktide except for exactly Murktide. It hits Dragon Rage Channeler, it hits Ragavan, it hits Magus of the Moon. It's also pretty good against Yawgmoth, but I also think Fire Spout might even be better against Yawgmoth. Fire Spout doesn't exactly hit Yawgmoth, but usually by the time Yawgmoth's down, you're already in really rough shape anyways, and I'd rather be able to potentially cast the spell a turn earlier and sweep some other stuff. So Fire Spout hits the Delighted Halfling, it hits the Bowmaster, Young Wolf, Insect tokens, it cleans up a lot of their board state. Notably, Storm's Wrath does hit Yawg, obviously, and it does also hit Grist, potentially, if it isn't been plus too many times. I'm still not sure which is exactly better. They have their pros and their cons. It's possible Storm's Wrath could be slightly better, but I think I really do still like Fire Spout in a lot of those games. And the most important thing about cards like Storm's Wrath and Fire Spout, and again, there's other ones that have similar effects. There's Anger of the Gods, which you could play, and some other weird, janky ones people have been cooking with. I think anything that deals less than 3 damage should not be considered. I think 3 damage is the sweet spot that you want to hit. Storm's Wrath notably hits Magus, and you want answers to Magus in the sideboard. I was, many months ago, originally playing Dismember to deal with Magus, but Dismember is obviously 1-for-1 removal. You do take a bunch of damage off of Dismember, which is not irrelevant. And a lot of times Dismember doesn't do anything if they don't have the Magus in play. So if your opponent has like a couple Rhinos in play and you have a Dismember, then it doesn't do anything. But if you have Storm's Wrath, it cleans up their board. And obviously if they have Rhinos plus like a Magus, then Storm's Wrath cleans up everything. So it's just this big value sweeper that's very good. Magus turns it on, it enables your sweeper, and because of all the red mana sources you're playing in your deck, you can still cast the sweeper if you'd like to normally. And I think Storm's Wrath obviously particularly shines against Rhinos because the 4 damage is super relevant there. Similarly, against a deck like Scam, sometimes Scam can really shred your hand apart and then go wide on you with 2, 3, 4 creatures, and even if they don't have Magus, if they do have Magus, regardless, hitting that Dismember off the top, especially when your life total's being pressured, doesn't always feel as good, even if it can get that one critical creature off the field. The Storm's Wrath is just a clean answer. It's just a clean top tick against Scam that sweeps every threat they have in their deck. It's very, very powerful. It has a much higher upside than a lot of these other cards. Occasionally, it will get stuck in your hand and it won't be useful, but usually you're not doing as poorly in those games where that happens. So if it's either unplayable or you're not using it, a lot of times you're doing fine in those positions. So I've liked it. And then Carnosaur is really there to respect Murktide. I talked with one of my buddies who is a big Murktide player. Done well at a lot of events. He's qualified for Denver, and he's played Murktide for a long time. And he said a big reason why players like Magus over Blood Moon isn't only because it's a little bit harder for Amulet to deal with, but it's also because it's easier for Murktide players to protect. And a lot of really strong Murktide players will do things like wait until they have 5 mana before they play Magus of the Moon so they can hold up like counter magic to interact with your Dismember. Now, I'm not saying that all Murktide players will have the luxury of doing this or will be able to do it, but it is a thing a lot of like higher level players will do, and having an uncounterable answer to the Magus, I think, is really high value. So that's one reason I really like trumpeting Carnosaur, and the other reason is obviously in a lot of these matchups you want more threats. So against something like Murktide, you're taking out Summoner's Pacts because Summoner's Pact does not match up well against Subtlety. If you have to pay for a pact the turn after your Titan gets Subtletied, you probably aren't going to be able to recast the Titan on that turn, and it basically time walks you. So you want these threats that you can still cast, that if they get Subtletied, you can recast them the following turn and continue to make it a problem for your opponent. You don't want to alleviate the pressure on them to give them turns to set up their creatures. And a lot of people talk about how, the Discover on the Carnosaur is not that good. Well, to be honest, it's not even like that is required for it to be good for Carnosaur to be a good creature. I still think the 7/6 with Trample is a reasonable enough body that it's strong enough and worth playing, and the Discover is almost like a bonus. I mean, if you get Carnosaur and then Discover into a ring, it's just insane. Even if you get Carnosaur and Discover into a Dryad, or Carnosaur and Discover into like your 1 or 2 Summoners packs that you still have in your deck, because Discover isn't Cascade, you can just put it into your hand. That's really, really good value. Really, the only bad things to Discover into are the Amulets and the Grazers. So you usually have like a 60% chance to Discover into something that's pretty impactful, but that's not the thing I want you to be focusing on at all with this card. I just want you to realize that it's an uncounterable answer to Magus, and it's also a threat that you can present when they don't have Magus. Because of that reason, I'm pretty high on this card. I'm also very interested in, for similar reasons, testing out Bone Crusher Giant. Now, I haven't really played with this card very much, but Stomp is also an answer to Magus on one half of the card. Now, Stomp itself isn't uncounterable, so maybe it matches up slightly worse sometimes against Murktide, but First of all, the other part of Stomp is very relevant. Damage can't be prevented this turn. I want to try out this card because also it forces damage through the One Ring, right? So the One Ring that your opponent uses when they cast it will not shield them from damage that you could potentially deal. And the One Ring is a problem for Titan. Titan can only kill at sorcery speed, right? Other decks that are comboing like Yogg or Hard Scales, they can kill you at instant speed and they don't care as much about the ring, but we do. And even in the mirror match, you could actually board in stuff like Bonecrusher Giant when your opponent plays their rings and just force through with your Titans and kill them. The other upside about Bonecrusher Giant is you can cast both sides. So you can stomp something or stomp their face, and then you can play the 4/3. With Carnosaur, you can only do one or the other. Now, the body on Carnosaur is obviously a lot more relevant, and the uncounterable effect of the discard outlet is relevant too, but I think there's some equity to Bonecrusher, and I might even try a split or some copies of both. I'm not really sure yet, but I think it's worth trying out both of them and weighing the advantages and disadvantages and asking yourself, which of those do I want to fulfill that sideboard role? So if you need another card for Murktide specifically, I really like Carnosaur. Maybe you need a card or that specific sideboard slot for something like Scam, where killing a dude and also playing the Vadi and getting that value is a little bit more relevant. I think that's up for you to decide. I've also considered cards like Sudden Shock, like all this spicy stuff, which is like another answer to Magus of the Moon that has split second that can't be countered. But I kind of discounted that because I think paying the extra 1 mana for the Carnosaur, which also has some upside, which also deals more damage, is a little bit better. I've been cooking with some wild stuff, but I think these are personally the options that I've enjoyed the most. And I'm going to probably decide between some number of Bone Crushers, Carnosaurs, and Stormsmith. I don't think you should be playing Lightning Bolt. I think that's a little bit of a mistake. I think if you're going to play an effect like that, you should play Dismember. Dismember, critically, you can play with mana of any color. So if you're playing a 1-mana removal spell, you want to be able to play it on turn 1 because you want to also be able to kill your opponent's turn 1 Ragavans. That's the equity you're losing by playing these red removal spells. You can't as often kill turn 1 Ragavans, which could run away from the game a little more. Now, obviously, we were playing Amulet, so we have Grazer. So that's what I lean on more when dealing with turn 1 Ragavans and trying to force my opponent to use the removal spell on a Grazer. So that is also one of the upsides of having a card like Dismember in your deck. So I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to play copies of this card. But these are also some of the reasons why I'm playing this red splash and why I think it's good right now. You could also do similar things with white splashes. I have a couple white splash cards we can talk about too. You can also do stuff like playing a copy of Stomping Ground in your sideboard if you want to have additional red sources, because I said in a lot of matchups you bring out your lands and you might need more to bring in to substitute those. So something like Stomping Ground or even like Grove of the Burn Willows. Stomping Ground's nice because if your opponent besages you, you can fetch up a Stomping Ground, so you have the dual colors, which is kind of cool. It doesn't really come up for any other reason. In all other situations, I'd usually rather have a Grove, but something like this, it's a red-green source, is kind of nice. And there's also this new card, World Soul's Rage. It's not officially out yet. It'll, I think, be legal maybe this week. World Soul's Rage, if you don't know what it does, it's X red-green. World Soul's Rage deals X damage to any target, put up to X cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. You might want to read that one twice because there's a lot of stuff going on. It deals damage to something, it puts lands into play, it can do lands from graveyard, it can do lands from hand, into play, tapped. The larger you pay for X, the more damage you deal, and the more lands you can put to play. You can deal damage to creatures with World Soul's Rage. The one that might come to mind immediately is Magus of the Moon. You need to have a forest in play, but that's a cool one. It can also shoot planeswalkers. It can also shoot your opponent in the face if you need to get through a final few points of damage. It also puts lands into play, so it's a ramp spell that also can attack something. So if you pay X equals 1, even if you kill a Ragavan, you can get an Urza Saga back from the graveyard, or you can just put a land from your hand into play. If you pay 3 or 4 for this, you can kill a decent sized threat and then either get some lands back or put your lands from your hand. This thing can do all sorts of stuff. There's an infinite combo that you can do with this that they're talking about in the Discord channel with double Amulet and Mirror Pool and instant speed sacrificing your Mirror Pool and then getting it back, and then you can copy worlds. It's crazy. So I'm not super sure I'm going to play any number of this card, but it's a card that you might want to think about and maybe could try. I think the floor of this card is pretty low. I think the ceiling isn't high enough for me to want to justify how low the floor is, if there's not good targets for it or how much mana you might need to spend on it, or if you don't have a basic forest to be able to use it. But either way, it's just something interesting to think about. Other cards that I'm almost surely playing. Third copy of Beseiju. I'm playing in my 75 somewhere, most likely in the sideboard, but I think having this additional effect is really good. Beseijus are obviously good against the Amulet Mirror. It's good against Tron. It's good against any deck that's playing something like Leyline Binding. I don't think you should think about this card too much as an answer to like artifact decks like Scales or Hammer, because all their spells are so cheap. You don't really want to be spending 2 mana to blow up one of them. You could bring it in against those matchups, but I don't want you to think that that's the purpose of this card or that's why it's really good or why it's in there. It's not really to answer those decks that are doing proactive artifact things. It's more so to answer things that are either dealing with your threats or things that are aggressive from an opposing combo deck or dealing with problem cards like Blood Moon. The card Radiant Fountain is really good. I bring this card in a ton of matchups, like all the top matchups. I'm pretty sure I bring it in against Scam, Rhinos, and Murktide. This card could realistically be a main board card, and I wouldn't fault you for playing this card in the main board if you wanted to add something else to your sideboard. I have it in the sideboard right now, is where I like it. It's also obviously a knockout card against Burn. I think that's worth having the card in on its own, but some people already think Burn is a phenomenal matchup regardless of having this card in, which might be true, but I really like having it. I think it makes the matchup even more favorable, and it also improves your matchups against a bunch of other decks. I love having the life gain as a tool in our deck, especially when we play the One Ring in these longer grindy decks. Being able to bounce a Radiant Fountain a few times and gaining 4 to 6 life is very, very relevant with this card in our deck. I think this card makes Radiant Fountain pretty valuable. Fog is good against Murktide. Turns off Delirium, turns off Murktide. It's obviously good against stuff like Living End. I actually don't have a lot of cards in my sideboard to respect Living End. Bog might literally be the only card I register in this deck to respect decks like that. We already have a good matchup against something like Dredge. We don't need extra graveyard hate for anything like that, but Living End is a bit of a problem deck. It's a deck I've struggled with a lot. I have a friend who is very good at Living End, who I used to grind the matchup with a lot to try and improve upon it. I've definitely gotten better, but it's a hard matchup for Titan to play against, especially now with all the free spells. They have Grief, they have Subtlety. Even if you keep the interaction that you have like in your hand, they can like counter it with a Force or a Subtlety or something, or take it with Grief. It's really hard to play against Living End. Even when I was playing a card like Endurance in my sideboard and even like a copy of Tormod's Crypt, like additional graveyard hate, it wasn't really improving my matchup against the deck super a lot. Even times when I was able to get Tormod's Crypt into play, they would force me to use it, and then they would just restock and play another Living End, and they would still sweep all my creatures with the first Living End. So I think the way you want to play that against that matchup is to bring in your defense grids to avoid stuff like Subtlety and instant speed Living End, and just play Bojuka Bog and then just hope you can do your best from there. Thankfully, there's a lot of the card Dorothy Voidwalker roaming around right now, which is helping keep Living End in check a little bit. I've considered cards like Dorothy that shut off Living End, like Containment Priest and other wacky stuff that is hard for them to deal with because they just can't really deal very well with creatures that shut down their combo. So like they can deal with a Rest in Peace by just Bosejuing it or using one of their evoke creatures that eats it, or Force of Vigor, or one of those other cards they bring in against our deck anyways. So I don't think like permanent hate is good enough unless it's specifically a creature. And I've been thinking about other cards that to bring in to combat decks like Living End. That's also a reason I've been considering some blue cards like Pact of Negation and Swan Song. If you are interested in playing some sort of counter magic in your pile for things like Living End, Creativity is another deck that can be a little bit challenging, and any other combo type deck like that, these are the cards I would first consider for your lists. Pact, I think, might be the best one because it's free. You don't have to hold up mana for it, which is important. You just need to make sure you set up the mana ahead of time in order to pay for it. So when you play your Titan and you can't win, but you need to make sure you have something to interact with your opponent, then Pact is a really nice option. A lot of people aren't playing this card anymore in Amulet. It used to be in every deck, but because people aren't playing it as much, it's a nice sleeper pick. It might not be as good for Denver, unfortunately, because of open deck lists. So I'm not as interested potentially in counter magic because you don't really get that equity of them not knowing if you have it in your deck, but Pact of Negation is still a pretty strong card. The real issue with Pact these days is you don't have as many blue sources in your deck. We used to play the card Gemstone Mines in Amulet, so we had 4 of those, 4 Simic, and we used to play 3 Tolaria West instead of 2, so there were 11 blue sources. These days, we don't really have that many. We have the 4 Simic, 2 T-West, and I'm playing Litjara, so I have 7. And you can't count Crumbling Vestige, you can't count Gemstone Cavern because it's not consistent enough. If you do have Dryad in play, that does add extra angles of paying for blue. You just have to be careful because then you're leaning into Dryad, and if they have an answer to Dryad, yada yada. Even with all that in mind, it's still a card worth considering. The other one, if you want one that you need to pay mana for, I like Swan Song. I originally was thinking a lot about Mystical Dispute because Mystical Dispute counters stuff like Subtlety, Force of Negation, it counters Tishana's Tidebinder, a lot of stuff out of Rhinos and other problematic blue decks, which I liked. But it doesn't deal with the cards I already mentioned. It doesn't deal with Living End. It doesn't deal with Indomitable Creativity, and I want a card that deals with both of those. Swan Song also is nice against other decks like 4-color, where it can counter stuff like Leyline Binding, and it just really counters everything out of the Creativity deck. Like, it counters their Leyline Bindings, it counters their Fable the Mirror Breakers, it counters Prismari Charm, it counters Creativity. So I think that the card is reasonable, but again, counter magic, the issue is you have to hold up the mana, and as an aggressive combo deck like Amulet, you really want to use all your mana every turn. Holding up blue is sometimes hard, and holding up mana in general is also really hard. There are cards that are on my radar, but they're not necessarily going to make my final list. The other card that most likely will make my list is Engineered Explosives. The obvious use case for this is just another thing that can sweep up rhinos. If I've wind up having enough red sweepers, we might not need this card. But the nice thing about Explosives is it also has utility outside the Rhinos matchup. It's very nice against these kind of random decks that you might not expect to play against that have all these weird permanent types, like these enchantment-y or artifact-y decks, or these decks that play a lot of like 0 drops or 1 drops. It's very useful against stuff like Death Shadow, like Jeskai Breach. It can blow up a Chalice. It hits a lot of just random, like, problematic permanents. And it's just a very nice catch-all to have in a tournament. I always really like having 1 copy of Engineered Explosives in my deck, and the fact that it's tutorable is huge. You can tutor it up even against Rhinos or against any other deck that you're bringing it in against. I think it's really nice. Most of the other decks that we would bring it in against potentially are decks we're already good against, like it could come in against Hammer or Scales, but we're already usually doing fairly decent against those. I would even bring it in against decks like Merfolk, which just has like a plethora of 2 drops, or you could even just play it on 1 and hit like their Vial and a 1 drop. It's really useful against those go wide creature decks, or just random stuff like Thopter Sword, janky other decks. It's just a good catch-all card. I like Explosives a lot. Other cards I'm thinking about. We have some other threats here that are interesting. Wormcoil Engine was a little bit better pre-ban when Scam was like by far the dominant deck. It was a great card to play through Blood Moon, or even if they don't have a Blood Moon type effect. And also just another great top deck you can have. I think Wormcoil is a little bit less good now, and 6 mana is a lot to ask. 6 mana is a lot to ask, and something like Generous Ent actually solves that problem a little bit, because Generous Ent has the alternate mode of forest cycling. Generous Ent is a good supplement if you want to play 3 basic forests. You could play like a Generous Ent up to, some people are playing 3 copies of Generous Ent in their sideboard, which is very crazy. This is one card I haven't gotten to test with that I'm most interested in trying. I haven't used this card. It helps in any of the matchups that play Blood Moon, where you just can cycle it to get a forest. It also is a creature you can just play. It's like kind of a similar role to Trumpeting Carnosaur, where it has like an alternate mode where it can help you with the Moon Hate, but it's also a threat, and the 7 toughness might actually be more relevant against decks like Murktide that have Unholy Heat that deal 6 damage, so it's like kind of hard for them to deal with. It's kind of a pretty vanilla body, but it does block Murktide Regent. It's pretty decent in those types of matchups, and it's definitely better than a Pact in stuff like Rhinos or Murktide. So again, we're taking out Pacts, sometimes 2 to 3 Pacts in a lot of these matchups, these subtlety matchups, and you need something else to bring in to supplement that. So Generous End is a good option that you should consider. It also does help against that problematic matchup Living End, which I mentioned. So if you play a couple copies of this card in your sideboard, it's something that you can cycle to put a creature in your graveyard. You could even tutor it with a Summoner's Pact and then cycle it. I don't really like Summoner's Pact too much in the Murktide matchups. I don't really like Summoner's Pact too much in the Living End matchups because of subtlety, but it's something you can still do. Sentinel of the Nameless City was a card that I was trying from the previous set, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, as just another threat to add to my deck when I shave on Summoner's Pacts. I wanted something that's like a good top deck against Scam, and I think it has better sizing than Tireless Tracker. Tireless Tracker dies to Lightning Bolt, and Tireless Tracker doesn't also scale as well with its toughness where it matters. Like Sentinel can actually easily become a 4/5 with Exploring, and then you can block Rhinos with it, which I think is super valuable. It's also not a card that they really want a subtlety. Like when you're playing a Sentinel, like Amulet turn 1, Sentinel turn 2, it's just kind of an annoying card for something like Rhinos. The Rhinos can't attack through it. If you play it and then like you're gonna get an attack with it once and maybe like put a +1 counter on it, it's just really annoying. And it's, I think, better than it looks. It's also good against Scam. It blocks Ragavans, blocks Bowmasters, it accrues you value, it draws you a card, it leaves a game object in play. Similar to Generous Ent, it's a little bit unassuming. I think it's like maybe a little bit better than it looks. So I was playing one. I think I found I had maybe too many cards to bring in against decks like Rhinos, and I kind of really wanted any card I brought in against Rhinos. This is my kind of conclusion. I kind of figured I wanted most cards I brought in against Rhinos to either be a defense grid, an answer to Magus, or a land to replace a land. So Sentinel got chopped after testing it, but I would consider trying it again. Speaking of alternate threats, a few more just to mention. World Breaker, also a little bit of a sleeper card. I think this card's pretty strong. I haven't played it in a couple years in Amulet, but I think it's also always a card you should think about because it is a threat that gets you value on cast, similar to something like Hydroid Krasis, but a little bit easier to cast, specifically under a Blood Moon. Now, notably, it is pretty challenging to cast under Blood Moon, although I do find a lot of these like Blood Moon-esque games dragging out a long time, and like I play a One Ring and I play a land, maybe like Grazer in a land, and have some blockers, and I'm playing like these longer games with One Rings and drawing cards, and it's just it's just a big body. It doesn't die to Unholy Heat, and it gets value when you cast it, even if it's countered for whatever reason. And you can bring it back from your graveyard. I think this card's really strong in those grindy-ish type games. I think it's really good against any sort of control pile, good against any deck that's playing like Leyline Binding, where you cast it, you pop the binding, you get that and your thing back. It blows up lands, so against something like Tron, you cast it and blow up one of their lands. It's like sometimes better to play this than play like a Titan if you have like no amulets for whatever reason. But I do think this card is solid, and I don't know if this is the right time to be playing it, but I think this card should just be something that you should consider. And then Dragonlord Dromoka is a good card for the white splash. I think Dragonlord Dromoka is one of the biggest reasons to play white splash. You can play cards like Kutzil, which is kind of like Defense Grid, but it's a creature and the effect is stronger, but it's easier for opponents to interact with, but you don't look as much. You could play stuff like Get Lost, which is good interaction for opponents, creatures, planeswalkers, and enchantments. You could play Rest in Peace, which is really nice specifically against Living End. There's a bunch of good white cards, Celestial Purge that you can play, but I think this is my personal favorite of all the white options. This card is a blowout against Murktide, Rhinos. Once you get into play against like any of those decks, it's kind of hard for them to beat. The only issue is getting it to play because it can still be subtletied, but again, it's better than a Summoner's Pact. The other issue, of course, is the white mana. So if you're playing a card like Dragonlord Dromoka, you can't really also commit to these red splash cards. So I'm not currently playing it. I don't have enough white sources. I think I have like 5 white sources I can play it. Like I have Sanctuary, 2 Vestige, a Cavern, and sometimes a gem. Or I have these Gardens, so which make it cost 7 mana. It's not a card I'm considering for this event, but it's a card that I have considered for lists I played. And I have played this card within the past year in tournaments before. And then Green Sun's Twilight, a card that I saw Dom play in one of his lists. Green Sun's Twilight is just kind of like a replacement for Summoner's Pact in the subtlety matchups. If they counter it, like if you spend 6 mana on this, they counter it. It doesn't require you to time walk yourself the following turn. This card also can do stuff like pay 6 mana, get a Titan and a land from your top 6 cards and put them both into play, which is cool. It doesn't hit a Titan more than maybe like 30% of the time, but it does hit something relevant maybe like 2/3 of the time. I think it's like 65% of the time. If you're playing 10 reasonable things to hit, so like if you're playing 4 Titans, 4 Dryad, and I board in 2 Carnosaurs, in a lot of the matchups I'd bring Green Sun's Twilight in, you take out Colossus, then I would say it has about 10 hits, and usually you have about a 65% chance to hit one of those 10 creatures as well as a land. A land you're almost always going to hit if you're paying 6, but you can scale it. So you could pay like 8 for it, and then you're up to like a 73% chance or something to hit one of your 10 creatures. Just a cool other option that you can consider. I actually just picked up a card of this in my store when I was there, just in case I decided to play it. Second copy of Gemstone Caverns. I already mentioned I really like this card, and I'm honestly probably closer to playing 2 than I am to playing 0. Likely I will maybe just play 1. We'll kind of have to see how we're feeling when the event gets closer. And another card I want to mention is Beast Within. Beast Within's a card I keep like coming back to, being like, ooh, this card answers both Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, which is something that no other card that we play really does. Not only that, but it also answers Ashiok, which is a problem card for Amulet also that people haven't been playing much in recent years, but don't be surprised if you see like a Brixis Control or a Dimir Death Shadow, even Scam, play like a copy of this in their sideboard, copy of Ashiok Dream Render, that's what it's called, I think. That card in play is a problem for Amulet. It attacks the deck on a unique way that something like Force of Vigor or the Moon effects don't attack it. It doesn't attack your lands, it doesn't attack your artifact enchantments, but it attacks your ability to search. So your Titans don't do anything when they enter the battlefield or attack. Your Summoner's Pacts can't be cast. Your Urza Sagas cannot be sacrificed to search for anything. T-West cannot be activated to search, and neither can Expedition Map. So it shuts off a good chunk of your deck, really all the relevant parts of your deck, and it's very hard to deal with. You can deal with it with Dryad plus Valakut, but you'd have to already have those pieces in your hand for it to work. You can put a big body in to attack it, but you can't haste the body because you can't tutor up your haste land, or maybe you can't tutor up the right manas to use your haste land. to attack so they can use sorcery speed removal on it. Beast Within is just a really sick catch-all card. It can also blow up lands in the Amulet Mirror, just like a Boseiju does. So if I was going to play like a 4th copy of a Boseiju-like effect, I would 100% play Beast Within, because not only is it good for hitting all the hate cards against Amulet, but it's also good against decks like Amulet Titan or Tron that are playing big mana as well. So don't discount this card. There are other cards that are probably good in Amulet Titan that I didn't mention that I have forgotten about. So if there's any that you guys think that we should be considering for Denver or that I should consider, you can definitely leave a comment down below. I'm sorry I can't give you guys an actual list to play for this event, but hopefully this gave you some ideas and things to think about and questions to ask yourself when putting your list together. If any of you want to watch me play Amulet Titan, I do so over on my stream, twitch.tv/NickDaru. If anyone else is going to RC Denver and you want to meet me, I'll be playing in the LCQs on Friday, so you might see me there. Ideally, I'll win one and play in the event on Saturday, but otherwise I'll be doing other fun events on Saturday. I most likely plan on playing the RCQ on Sunday, the standard RCQ with Domain. And other than that, if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to this channel. There's probably going to be a link on the screen to some of the other Amulet Titan content that we've done previously, and I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video or at an event or something. And thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.